By 1971, the most trusted man in Saigon carried a press badge from an American magazine. Generals took his calls, the CIA asked for his read on the war, and reporters called him the Dean of the Vietnamese Press Corps. He drank coffee with the officers running the war. What nobody in that room knew was that the quiet journalist across the table answered to North Vietnamese intelligence, and every secret they let slip was already moving toward Hanoi. So how did an entire high command miss him for almost 30 years? If you had asked anyone in Saigon about Pham Xuan An in 1962, they would have told you he was simply the sharpest reporter in the city. They had no idea. An had been sent to California in 1957 to study journalism, interned at a newspaper in Sacramento, and come home in 1959 speaking flawless English and understanding Americans better than most Americans did. He wrote for Reuters, then for Time, and became the first Vietnamese person hired as a full-staff correspondent for a major American publication. That was his cover. It was also the perfect weapon. The same reputation that made him the perfect journalist made him the perfect spy. And almost never had to steal a document. Officers, officials, even the South Vietnamese secret police handed him classified briefings because explaining the war was literally his job, and who understood the war better than An? In plain terms, the men planning the campaigns were briefing the enemy and calling it a friendly chat with a reporter. The irony ran deeper than anyone realized. For a time, An even worked alongside Dr. Tran Kim Thuyen, the South's own intelligence chief, helping prepare the very agents Saigon was sending out to hunt communists. He was a trusted asset for one side and a strategic agent for the other, in the same office, on the same afternoon. What he did with all of it was patient and almost invisible. And wrote his real reports in invisible ink, rolled undeveloped film into tiny canisters, and tucked them inside egg rolls that couriers carried out to the countryside. His analysis was so sharp that the North Vietnamese commander Vo Nguyen Giap reportedly joked that Hanoi was now sitting inside the American war room. But here is the detail that everyone missed at the time. An's quiet analysis reached all the way to the battlefield, and it cost lives. In January of 1963, South Vietnamese forces moved on a small village called Ap Bac, expecting an easy sweep against a handful of guerrillas. The guerrillas were waiting. Warned in advance, a few hundred fighters stood their ground, shot down 5 helicopters, and humiliated a much larger force that had American advisors and armor. An and his network, codenamed H-63, were part of the reason those fighters chose to stand and fight. Reporters in the room started asking, for the first time, whether this war was really being won. That was the war the public could see. Behind it, the same quiet reporting was shaping far bigger operations. This is where the story takes a turn nobody expected. In 1971, the South launched Lam Son 719, a massive push into Laos to sever the Ho Chi Minh Trail. It was meant to prove that South Vietnamese troops could win on their own. Instead, the North seemed to know they were coming. An is credited with passing details of the plan to Hanoi beforehand, and the offensive collapsed into one of the worst defeats of the war, with elite airborne, marine, and ranger units torn apart in the hills. You would think someone would have said something. Nobody did. But An wasn't done. Not even close. In 1970, when American and South Vietnamese forces swept into Cambodia to destroy the hidden communist command post running the war in the south, that headquarters had already vanished. An is credited with passing word in time for its leadership to slip across the border before the attack ever landed. If you are learning something new about this war, take a second to subscribe, because the second half of this story is where it gets even stranger. While An was quietly feeding Hanoi from a cafe table, A very different kind of agent was already inside the government itself. His name was Phạm Ngọc Thảo, and his mission was not to steal secrets. It was to break the South from within. Thảo came from a wealthy Catholic family and had fought with the communist Viet Minh. But after the country split in 1954, he publicly walked away from all of it. On secret orders, he stayed in the South, played the loyal anti-communist officer, and used his Catholic connections to win the trust of President Ngo Dinh Diem himself. Thảo rose fast. As a provincial chief, he was praised as a reformer, and he quietly released more than 2,000 prisoners, many of whom went straight back to the fight. But his real work was chaos. That decision to plant himself inside the state looked small at the time. It wasn't. Thảo became a fixture in coup after coup, helping topple Diem in 1963, and then throwing the shaky military governments that followed into one crisis after another. In February of 1965, he helped launch an open coup with tanks in the streets of Saigon. It failed, but the turmoil helped collapse the ruling junta anyway, which was exactly the kind of instability Hanoi wanted. And here is the part that is almost hard to believe. When Thảo was finally hunted down and killed in 1965, his captors tortured him to death, still not knowing the truth. They never learned that the colonel they had just killed was one of the North's most important strategic agents. His own side kept his identity secret for years afterward, partly to protect family members who were living in the United States. And outlived them all. When Saigon fell in 1975, he stayed. In the last hours before the city collapsed, he quietly made sure that Dr. Tran Kim Thuyen, the same intelligence chief he had once worked beside, got a seat on an evacuation helicopter, most likely so no interrogation would ever expose the friend who had fooled them all. Then An was rewarded, and just as quickly distrusted for being too close to the Americans he had deceived. He spent a year in re-education, lived under a form of house arrest, and was eventually promoted to Major General and named a hero of the armed forces. He died in 2006 at the age of 79. The strangest part is that many of the American reporters he had lied to for decades stayed his friends after they learned the truth. Giap once joked that Hanoi was sitting inside the American war room. For years, thanks to a reporter with a press badge and a colonel with a fake conversion, the enemy really did have the floor plan.